Jeff, welcome. And so this is going to be a very loose conversation, and I really want to say very little, but it is really about our journeys, your journeys with Gettysburg, both as an individual and then in your professional work, and obviously the role that, your father's work, your work, your work now, how that has shaped and why it continues to shape, and quite frankly, most importantly, why we have to keep shaping it. And that's a constant evolution. So, Ken, how did you first come to the Civil War at Gettysburg? Do you remember?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just looking at your risk notes. You look like Tom Brady.
Yeah, that's just my point. So, as you guys know, we're doing this film festival. My schedule is absurd. And so I literally
It's
have
third and long.
So if I tackle you, throw it deep to Gronkowski. Right?
First of all, I am so honored to be here today. Andrew, what you've created, the community, what you've created is so spectacular. It's really wonderful. It should be. I'll help do anything I can going forward to help publicize it. If people come here, they ought to be also coming here as well, in addition to, this most important battlefield in our history. I'm so honored to be here with Jeff, whose work on his own I admire so much, whose father's work I admire so much, and to be here in the presence of colleagues that I've worked with for decades, Jay and Molly and Jacqueline Schwab, pianist, and Jay Unger, fiddle player, and Molly Mason, guitar, and anything else we ask her to play. They've made the films, all art aspires to be music, When it dies and goes to heaven, it wants to be music. And these people, it's the Wynton Marsalis said to me that it's the only art form that's invisible, and it works on you much faster. And so the films are, to me, as good as the music. And these people have provided a huge part of the soundtracks of the films we've made. So I'm very happy to be here. The first time I was ever in Gettysburg, Gettysburg was in my imagination as a little boy. I grew up, I remember very well the centennial, as I'm sure you do, of the Civil War. It was a big deal. I had been given a few years before, my brother and I, a set of Civil War soldiers, blue and gray. I was older, I was always blue. My brother was always gray, because, older brothers have to win,
Never did the first day's battle, always the third day's.
Yeah, right. Those are little details, right? And then I did read Jeff's dad's work. David McCullough had asked me, he said, "You read The Killer Angels?" And at that point, I had no idea what he was talking about. And I don't think he gave it to me as he did many books, but he just said, you should read this. And so I had noticed that all of the subjects of my first films, on the Brooklyn Bridge, on the Shakers, on Huey Long, on the Statue of Liberty, on the Congress and Thomas Hart Benton, all of them had the Civil War as a determining part of the story that we were telling. And so every place I turned, I felt like I was checked by this big, huge, mammoth moment in American history. And then I read the relatively short novel of the Battle of Gettysburg. It actually begins before that and leads up, and the story of principally Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who was to me an unknown figure that I couldn't keep which Confederate general and which Union general was this besides Lee and Grant. But it really made an impact in my mind, and then I remember I would dream about it, and I would keep my thumb at the various battle situation maps that are throughout the novel. And so I had been here, but I had never been here. And one day, a dear friend of mine, Michael Hill, who worked as a researcher and a co-producer on a lot of films, and I were in Washington, where he lived, and he said, "Let's drive up to Gettysburg." And so we went a different way, and we're coming up through the center of what is Pickett's Charge, and I suddenly realized that. I'm trying to get oriented, and all of a sudden, the maps in my mind and the images in my imagination were merging with reality, and I just yelled, "Stop." And he stopped, and I got out of the car, and I ran all the way up to the copse of trees, to the high water mark of the Confederacy, and it was just, that's the first time I was here. And I was just saying, this 3 or 4 year span that I haven't been here because of COVID and other things, it's been too long, and it's happy to be back.
Yeah. And so in that book, of course, Jeff, your dad, you came here as a a tourist as a kid.
We
and your
were,
dad.
yeah, we were tourists. We had been to the New York World's Fair, 1964, and we had family up in that part of the country. And my father decided to take a side trip. We drove from Florida up to New Jersey. Decided to take a side trip in the car and drive over to Gettysburg to show the kid. I was the kid. I also had a battalion of Civil War soldiers. I had both sides. I played them against each other. And my mother would throw me out of the house because I made a wreck of the bedroom floor. But, we came here just to see what was going on. And my father had done some reading, and he had read about Joshua Chamberlain. He'd read a book called The 20th Maine, John Poland's book, and a couple others. And so he had some idea of what he was going to be looking at. But what happened to my father was first and foremost a storyteller. History had nothing to do with it. And walking around the battlefield, he understood this was a story. And he got very excited about that. Now, I'm often asked, what other historical works did Michael Shaara write? And the answer is none. The Killer Angels is the only historical work he did, but it's not just the genre, it's that, specifically Gettysburg, this is a story he wanted to tell. And the characters he got excited about, whether it was Chamberlain or Buford or Lee or Longstreet or Lewis Armistead, somehow it spoke to him. And it started in Odyssey. It took him 7 years to write the book. He was the kind of writer he had he had to teach to make a living. He was one of those writers who most writers can relate to who does not make a living from his writing. And so he was a teacher at Florida State, and where I went to school, and that's how he made his living. So he would write from midnight to 5 a.m., sleep until noon, and then teach all afternoon. That was kind of a tough life. But it took him 7 years to write The Killer Angels. Now, when he finished the book, 1971, 72, he started selling it around New York, had an agent, and absolutely nobody wanted to read a book about the Civil War. It was turned down by the first 15 publishers who saw it. If you think about the early 70s, what was going on? The winding down of the Vietnam War. And absolutely, books about generals were absolutely out of fashion. And so that was a bitter disappointment to my father. He finally found a publisher, a small independent publisher, the David McKay Company in New York. They agreed. They wrote an advance check for $3,500, and they published The Killer Angels with no expectations that this book would do anything. There were 3,000 copies issued in the first edition, hardcover, of which very few exist today. They're very rare because most of them went to libraries, and of course they don't survive when they go to libraries. The book comes out and bombs, does absolutely nothing commercially. Another disappointment for my father. And then this marvelous miracle happens. In May of 1975, this telegram, which is here in the museum, the telegram comes to my parents' house. Congratulations, The Killer Angels has been awarded the 1975 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Now that changed my father's life. It changed all our lives. It maybe changed Ken's life.
Indeed.
And even then, the book was not successful commercially. Again, it was out of fashion. It was a subject nobody really cared about, unless there was a sort of cult of Civil War buffs that picked it up. If you were in the military, you probably read it. Officers were required to read this book at all the military academies. So it had a little bit of a life, but not much. And it was only when they started talking about a film, and Ron Maxwell approached my father about doing a film, that the engine began to turn on and things began to crank with The Killer Angels. Regrettably, my father didn't live to see that. He died in 1988 from his second heart attack. He was only 59. He was a 4-pack-a-day man. And so the film comes out in 1993, makes his book a #1 bestseller, as often happens with films, and he doesn't live to see it. So it's a story, it's a legacy that I'm carrying on, that I'm walking in big footsteps, and I never take that for granted. And it's the fact that I'm sitting here talking about this is a testament to that.
And so Jeff, so the 70s, it's somewhat of a critical success, but it's not making money. He's still a struggling author to make a living. And I mean, how does David McCullough get the book to give it to you? He just
I don't know. He was omnivorous reader,
Yeah,
and
sure.
and was amazing. There is a really interesting connection in all of this, because I never met Michael Shaara. Jeff and I have met before, but you know what happened was that after the Civil War series was out in September of 1990, Ron Maxwell, the director of the Gettysburg movie, called me up and just said, I'm trying to get this made, I'm trying to get this made. And I said, you know, this is not, I'm in documentaries and public television and I don't know this world of Hollywood or whatever. But it turned out in early 91, I was awarded the Producer of the Year by the Producers Guild in documentary. And Kevin Costner was awarded for what's the Dances with Wolves.
Yeah.
And so we met, and the MC of this event at the Beverly Hilton was Ted Turner.
of course.
And Ted Turner said to me, "Man, I really liked your film. Will you come and see me tomorrow morning for breakfast?" So he had married Jane Fonda recently, and so we went to her house. She was away, and we had breakfast together, and we talked and talked. And he said, "Now look, there's this guy peddling this movie called Gettysburg, based on this novel called The Killer Angels." I said, "Ted, this is how I got inspired to do the Civil War, and I think you should do this thing. It's such a fantastic story," having not read a script or anything like that, but Ron and I had spoken. And he said, "You think so?" And Ted is quite an unusual person. He's a testament to the efficacy of lithium, among other other pharmaceuticals. And he said, "Well, then, damn it, I'm going to do it then." And so I kind of, it was a little bit of a scary time, and I left, and I came back, and came back home, and within a day of getting home to New Hampshire, where I live, from Los Angeles, I get a call from Ron saying, "We just got greenlighted. Ted Turner's going to do it and going to make the film, and I want you to be in it," right? And he said, "Think about what role you want." I said, "I'll just be a dead Confederate in Devil's Den or something." And then he called up and he told me that the scene, the day I was coming, he said, "Okay, so we're shooting this moment where the largest, at that point, artillery barrage in the history of humankind took place from the southern side to the northern side, and that it was, you know, devastating and whatever." And I said, "That's such an amazing moment, because you have Winfield Scott Hancock riding up and down in the midst of this, holding the Union line." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "And he's got the greatest line ever." And he goes, "Well, besides the noise, it's a silent scene." I said, "Are you kidding? You know, somebody comes up and grabs the rein of the horse and says, 'General, get down. We can't spare you.'" And he says, "There are times when a corps commander's life does not count." And he said, "Great, you're going to be the guy who pulls the horse." So, keeping my day job, but take one. They got it. So that's my connection. It was the most terrifying thing when the barrage went off. The Union barrage in response. I don't know what the statistics are. Maybe you know. It was a fraction of the number of artillery pieces, using no actual projectiles, and a quarter of the charge. And it was the scariest sound I had ever heard in my life. They made sure that we would, you either held my face was down in the mud, and you had to keep your mouth open so your eardrums wouldn't blow out. It was just one of the most terrifying, and it reminded me in a way that your beautiful interactive thing that you've created here, as you guys will shortly get to experience, is just amazing. It puts you in it, and I suddenly had my first real sense of what being in battle was like, and this was nothing flying through the air. It was just a fraction of what the sound must have been that day.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
just one way, too.
Yeah, and just one way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want a little anecdotal thing I'll throw out. The film was always to be called The Killer Angels.
Yeah.
Ron actually has in his house a poster. A lot of you have seen the Gettysburg movie poster. That's with the sky and the red sunset and the troops below and all that. Well, Ron Maxwell has one of those in his house, only it says The Killer Angels. And Ted's people got nervous
Yep.
because what does that title mean?
Means nothing. Yep.
And I think the story I heard is they went to Lenox Square Mall in Atlanta, these people with the clipboards.
Yep.
And you walk by and they ask, we're making a movie called The Killer Angels. What do you think it's about? And overwhelmingly, the response was that it was about biker gangs. And one person, and I know this to be true, one person actually said they thought it was a film about crime-fighting nuns. Well, this goes back to Ted. His marketing people go back to Ted in a panic and say, we can't do this. And so they changed to the generic title, Gettysburg. And we were devastated, my family, because we thought, well, that's the end of any connection anyone will make between the Killer Angels and the film. And I actually wrote a letter to Ted, and he responded, and I sort of beseeched him, please, reconsider. And he was like, no, we have the marketing people say we have to do it this way. And of course, we were dead wrong, because the week the movie came out, The Killer Angels became a #1 bestseller, 19 years after it was published and 5 years after my father's death. So but I can imagine the face on these marketing people when they saw the responses to what they thought the movie was about.
It's so funny because with the exception of 2 titles in my, 40 films or whatever, all of them are just generic. So you just never know. I wonder what Mark Twain's about. I wonder what the Civil War, baseball, jazz is about. I wonder what, the Statue of Liberty is about, the Brooklyn Bridge is about. We've kept it pretty. There's been a couple little poetic ones, and they don't do anywhere near as well as the ones.
Oh, really? So the ones that aren't named specifically what it is, I guess.
Like Not For Ourselves Alone, which is about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And Empire of the Air less so, because it was clearly about radio from the way it was done. But I found it better to just say what it is.
Yeah.
I made a film with a partner named, it was called The Sharps War originally. It was about a Unitarian minister and his wife who got people out of Prague and then southern France before and during the beginning of the Second World War. Very heroic couple. And nobody wanted it, even PBS, just like, we should be taking, anything that I do. They said, we need the word Nazi in the title, So that film is called Defying the Nazis,
Interesting. So that's the marketing of it again. Yeah, it's so crucial to it. And so, Jeff, you're not a writer, professional writer at this moment in the early 90s, right? And so...
No, I had never written anything before, and actually it was Maxwell came to me after the success of Gettysburg and the success in following of the Killer Angels. Ted, as you said, Ted got excited, and he wanted to make more movies. And Ron came to me, and he said he wants to do before and after Gettysburg, take the same characters, most of the same characters, spread them out in both directions, and start with a book. So, okay, well, I'd never, again, this isn't false modesty. I had not written anything, but I thought this was something I'd like to try to do, and Ron and I actually had the conversation, if whatever I do, whatever I put on paper, if it stinks, it goes in the trash, and nobody will ever see it. So I had, that took away the fear, because people have often asked me, weren't you afraid to try to do this? No, because it's either going to work or it's not. So I started work on a manuscript, and I did the same kind of research my father had done, all the original source material, getting back into the voices of the characters as much as possible, and started working on this manuscript. And meanwhile, I'm the businessman in my family, so I'm representing my father's estate in New York, and Random House now has the #1 bestseller with Killer Angels. So they're taking my phone calls. And so I'm talking to the publisher, and I told her, what I was working on. I said, I'm working on the prequel to the Killer Angels, and it's called Gods and Generals. And she said, oh, send us the manuscript. Okay, now there's fear, so, okay. So I sent the manuscript up, and the phone call I got back, and this is September of 95, 27 and a half years ago. The phone call I got back was, we don't care if it's a movie, we like the book, and we think you're a writer, and here's a contract. That changed my whole life. Gods and Generals comes out and debuts on the bestseller list. Now, I'm under no illusions that the great American author has arrived. I mean, I know that people wanted more of the Killer Angels. And I got cut slack by the critics and publicity people all over the country, newspaper articles, rooting for me. It was a very strange experience. And I've said this many times to audiences, but the one headline that got me, for anyone who's a Hemingway fan, it was in the Washington Post.
I know. Let me guess what it is. Having just done a film on Hemingway, the sun also rises.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that was daunting to see that in giant, font. Yeah, it was a very surreal experience. But I mean, then of course it came time to do the sequel, which is The Last Full Measure. And now there's fear like mad, because now there's expectations. Now there's a publisher in New York that's happy with what I did. They want more. And so, the fear of going into that story, I think it made me a better writer, having that fear, and getting rid of the arrogance and do the work. But that's the start of my career. Now, my next book comes out in May. It's called The Old Lion. It's a novel on the life of Teddy Roosevelt, and that's my 19th book. And so well.
Well, and just to stop back, so your career changes because of...
like night and day. I had left having shot 60% of my first film on the Brooklyn Bridge and moved from New York City, where I could no longer afford to live unless I got a real job, to the farmhouse I live in now in New Hampshire. And 44 years later, I'm still there. But everything changed on the night of Sunday, September 23rd, 1990. It changed for Jay and Molly as well. Jay had written this beautiful piece. One of his band members named Russ Barenberg in a band called Fiddle Fever, which produced an album in the early 80s, and Russ sort of decamped for Nashville, which I thought was the stupidest career move ever. Who would go to Nashville? I mean, what happens in Nashville? And having now made country music, I wish, but he left me, not Jay, he left me with a copy, who I'd worked with, he left me with a copy of their Fiddle Fever album, and I listened, the needle drops, these were vinyl, and on the fourth song on the first side, I heard the first few things, and I pulled it off, and then I went, wait, listen to the song. I listened to the whole song, and I was blown away, and I went to Jay, and I said, all the stuff we played, I want this written by a Jewish kid from the Bronx in 1983 to be this link, one of the most beautiful Scotch-Irish things, something that he wrote. He and Molly have a music camp in the sort of shadows of the Catskill Mountains called Shokin, which is named after a reservoir, and that feeds New York City, part of the reservoirs that feed the city. And the camp was ending at the end of the summer, and he wrote this Ashokan farewell piece that is the only non-contemporary to the Civil War piece in the film, and it transformed the film. And I kept calling up Jay saying, you said $500. I think I'm going to give you another $500. And I think that by the time we finished, it was up to like $4,500, because I just felt like there was nothing that I could possibly pay him that would repay him for the beauty of this song. It was played when I went on The Tonight Show for the first time. It was played at a state dinner at the White House that I happened to be there. I have heard it played, and nothing like, I've heard people say, isn't that really good? And I go, you're still missing the notes are a little bit wrong. Well, how do we get it right? And then they never quite get it as perfectly as Jay and Molly, and later Jacqueline would play for us. And so that changed everything. But I also want to say and I don't know where he is because I haven't seen him, but Andrew had mentioned, or you had mentioned that Shelby Foote's son, I call him Huggy, was here. Where
He's
are
here,
you?
yeah.
There he is. Hey, friend. So while we're on the subject of words, let us remember that his father wrote, this is a novelist who took some time off to write in 1955 a pamphlet or a sort of a small book for Random House about the history of the Civil War. He'd been asked to do that. And he ended up taking essentially 20 years of his life to write a book that is on the level of Gibbon and Macaulay in terms of histories, written from a Southern perspective without a Southern bias. And it is a 3,000 page, three volume work of art that you could begin it at any place. It is so beautiful, written, you know, he needed just a few hundred words a day, written in this extraordinary calligraphy, decipherable only by a couple of human beings on the earth at the time. He had watched my Brooklyn Bridge and Huey Long film and agreed, otherwise he wasn't going to do an interview. We went back to him 2 more times afterwards, and I will tell you not what happened to me, but I will tell you that he told me when we were there that he had sold 30,000 sets of a book that also received a Pulitzer Prize from published, 30,000 sets of a $30 book. So it's not an insignificant number of sales, 3 times 3, in the 15 years from when it was published, or the 3rd volume came out, and when the series aired. In the next 6 months, it sold 90,000 copies. And the greatest call, the simple answer to your question, one of the best phone calls I've ever had in my life is I pick up the phone, I go, hello? He says, Ken, you made me a millionaire.
That's fantastic.
Did I tell you that? I mean, it's just so, it was just, I said, Shelby, that's the happiest news I've ever heard. That's so great. So.
But I think that gets sort of this broad point of this evolution of the art of the telling of history and the medium you're using, the way you're working, that keeps changing. This museum is using technologies and things that didn't exist, certainly, you know, when the Killer Angels was being written, or even when the movie or the documentary being produced.
The key is what Jeff said. It's just about story. And fortunately, history is mostly made up of story. So, you know, we're grounded in that. And it doesn't matter what the bells and whistles are. We've actually kind of obstinately and defiantly tried to avoid as much of that as we can and not let the technological tail wag the dog. It's much tougher for Jeff or for Shelby, who had to go back and be alone in that process and do it. And while I hope we've grown as filmmakers, at the same time, we're still adhering to a basic service to what makes a good story. Sure. And whatever internal voice that you hear that tells you what's in tune, you know, to borrow a kind of a musical thing. And so the key is to me, for whatever, I mean, this place is spectacular for those added things, but what's most spectacular about it is its mastery of the story. That's what's really terrific. And it sounds simple, and it is essentially simple, and us human beings have been following it since Aristotle told us about beginnings and middles and ends and climaxes and characters and antagonists and protagonists and denouements. All of that stuff is Aristotelian poetics, as they say in college, but it just comes down to how you edit human experience. That's what a story is.
And why is it so vital that Gettysburg story has to keep going?
Well, it's just, I mean, what's so amazing is that you can feel in the presence of this, I mean, look, what happened down there is the greatest battle in North America. I mean, if you exclude the oceans, it's the greatest battle in the Western Hemisphere. It is so central to our history, the most important event in our history. This is the decisive 3 days. 3rd day is it, right?
Sure.
They don't call it the high water mark of the Confederacy and let's remember that the United States government to this day does not call it the Civil War. They do not ever use the word Confederate. They call the people who are fighting rebels, and it's called the War of the Rebellion. That's what it is. So let's remember the important thing about that. But how to distinguish yourself? I mean, it's not an inferiority complex. It's just how do we say we are at the same time as we accidentally hosted this consequential moment, which was so devastating, with such incredible loss of life and such incredible injury and such incredible trauma for the country and whatever. And so what you've done by saying, you know, a little bit north where it's a little bit south, this is who we are. We are this, and it's a wonderful. It's existential and it's self-defining, and it's a beautiful accomplishment. It really is spectacular, and you distinguish yourself. You haven't ignored it, as you were trying to do in your film, but you came around, right?
Well, it's in the film. It just wasn't in the title.
Right, no,
it wasn't in the title.
No, it wasn't in the title.
And
And it is a wonderful, wonderful film. And I get sent all this stuff all the time, and I wade through lots of stuff, and I went, whoa. And I didn't acknowledge my dear friend Gabor and Liz, who are here today, who introduced me then to their teenage son when I first came around, and also how much you've helped me understand the Civil War and understand story and the larger meaning, because you don't tell stories unless it isn't just the set of accumulation of facts. There's something in which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that's certainly been, Gabor, your work.
wow. All right, well, I can give you each just a final word. We're going to wrap it up, and then you guys are going to get to see something pretty spectacular. Some pretty good words. There's a quote for you, Andrew, right there on the museum.
Well, I think Ken obviously summed up the whole essence of storytelling, which is what that's my job. And when it comes to this museum, what I like about, sort of on a nuts and bolts level, you've got all these exhibits, and each one of them is interesting enough on its own, I mean, in a vacuum, but they tie together. And this museum, as you go through it, that tie, that connection does tell a story, and it does create a story so that by the time you get to the end of this, I know I felt this, and I hope you do as well, there's an emotion to it. There's a level of something that very visceral when you get to the end and you see the faces of the people who have been telling you these stories, and you see them, and you feel like you know them already. It's a spectacular. This is a spectacular place, and we are very, very fortunate that with what the job Andrew's done and his whole team, what they've put together for us, and I just hope it's as appreciated by the general public, people who've never been to Gettysburg yet, who have no idea what they're going to find when they get here. Those people need to be brought here. We need to find out a way to bring the public in here, because they will get something from this. And you can get a lot from walking the battlefield, certainly. My father did. But this adds a richness to it that's so much deeper. And it's profound. And I hope you all have a similar experience.
Jeff said it. It's great.
All right, well, Jeff Shaara and Ken Burns, that was pretty special.